joining me. I hope you've all been replenished with coffee. Venkat and Brian did a good job in cheering everybody up, so that's great. I would like to get started with a question. Who of you has seen this recently? Start of spring.io. And, well, personally, I was a bit shocked by this. Because they decided that Gradle would be a better default choice if you want to generate a Spring Boot starter. I was disappointed a bit. But it turned out it was no mistake. It was actually a deliberate choice. The guys behind startupspring.io had a ticket for it, with a lot of arguing, saying it's better to default back to Gradle. But luckily, somebody chimed in, a certain Maarten, who decided not to be in this room today, although he could have been. Your loss, Maarten. And he said, I just wanted to mention that Maven is working on a lot of nice things. Most of them are already available for use. And those things, that's exactly what we're going to cover in the next 50 minutes. So, what's cooking in Maven? Let me quickly introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Maarten Mulders. I'm a Java champion and Oracle Ace Pro, and I work at InfoSupport. InfoSupport is a firm here in the Netherlands. If you know us, if you would Google us, you would see we do mainly consultancy. And you might be wondering, why is somebody who is in consultancy, first of all, not wearing a suit, and secondly, going to talk about Maven? Well, because next to the consultancy work that I do, I also contribute on a regular basis to Apache Maven. So I know a few things that are happening in the ecosystem, and I'm very happy to share those with you today. So, I decided to wrap the whole thing as kind of a menu. I'm not sure if you like food as much as I do. I do like food a lot, and well, the country for good food is obviously France. So, le menu du jour, and I see some people here who are better in French, so please excuse me, or today's menu in plain English is going to consist of an entree, which is going to be the Maven Wrapper. Then we have our plat principal, which is the main course. I'm going to tell you a bit about how the build and consumer POM are going to be decoupled. Then we will have our fromages or cheeses, which is a couple of nice improvements in the Maven reactor. And we are wrapping up with the Maven Daemon. That's on the menu. Are you feeling a bit hungry already? Not too much. Well, maybe we can boost your appetite a little bit. Between each of the sections, there will be a little bit of room for questions, one or two probably per section, and obviously there will be room for questions at the end. So, let's get started with the Maven Wrapper. What is the Maven Wrapper all about? Well, the main goal of the Maven Wrapper is to ensure that everybody on your project is using the same version of Maven. It's as simple as that. The last thing that we want to have is that we are having a README in our project repo that says, oh, by the way, you need Apache Maven 3.6 or higher, but not 3.6.9 because that one's buggy. But better is to have 3.8 whatever. Using Maven Wrapper gives us the opportunity to say everybody in the project is using the same version of Maven. And we do that by providing you with a few wrapper scripts that you are going to invoke instead of MVN. So instead of MVN, you're going to run MVNW for wrapper, which is a simple shell script that will run on Linux, on macOS, on Solaris, and even on Windows. Can you imagine how much effort that took? It's not a really new thing, by the way. The Maven Wrapper has already been there for quite a while. It used to exist outside of the Apache Software Foundation, developed by a separate company, but now it has been moved over to the Apache Software Foundation, making sure that it is managed and maintained by the same people that also maintain Apache Maven itself. And as I said, main goal, you don't have to worry about the version of Maven that you and the team have. So let's take a little look at how that works. And I have a few demos prepared for that. What we usually would have done is we would have invoked the old wrapper, the thing that was not maintained by Apache Maven, the Tikari wrapper, for those of you who remember the name. And it would create, as I said, a Maven W command and a Maven W script. Now, as I said, this is the old one. We're not supposed to use those anymore, so we're going to remove them. Not remove the POM, obviously. That would hurt a little bit. And now we're going to generate it again using the Apache wrapper script. That's just a little helper for me so that I don't have to remember all the commands. There is a small difference. In the old situation, if you would generate the wrapper, you would say io Tikari colon Maven colon version colon wrapper, which is quite a bit to remember, right? In newer versions of Maven, we can simplify saying Maven wrapper colon wrapper, which is because now we can actually leverage the Maven plugins namespace. And for even newer versions of Maven, we can probably simply type Maven wrapper. But that's for that. We specify the version of Maven that we want to have, 3.8.6, which is the latest table release at this point. And again, I will see that I have a Maven W CMD and a Maven W script. Now, I'm going to spin up a clean environment here for you, which is a Docker container, which does have Java installed. Brilliant, but does not have Maven installed, which is quite a bit of a shame. But as I said, this wrapper script is there to help you address that, because you can invoke the wrapper rather than having to install Maven system-wide. And I could say, for instance, Maven W compile, which is going to download Maven, and then have Maven download the rest of the internet. As we all know, that's what Maven basically does. And finally compile our project. I still don't have Maven installed, not system-wide, but I can inspect my local Maven repository. Not my local Maven repository, my local Maven directory. There's a wrapper script folder there, one level deeper, which shows us eventually there's a distribution of Maven. It has this particular version number, it has a magic string, and then it has Apache Maven 386, which contains a default Maven installation. The magic string, by the way, is simply copied from the Tikari wrapper, which in turn is copied from the Gradle wrapper. There, I said the word again, the Gradle wrapper. So that's just a random string, which doesn't really add a lot of information there, but it's a funny detail to mention that, well, it's there, and it's actually inspired by how Gradle also works. So, a default Maven installation. Now, if I have a different project that requires Maven, then and a different project that requires the same version of Maven, I could simply say, okay, I'm going to reuse this downloaded distribution, but if I have a different Maven project that requires a different version of Maven, it will download another copy of that other version. Any questions so far? Because this was all I had to tell about the wrapper. There's one question?
How do you ensure that your wrapper is being up to date?
How can you be sure that a wrapper is up to date? That's an interesting one. The wrapper doesn't change that often, by the way. Also, the Tikari wrapper has been pretty stable for, I think, decades even, at least many years. Well, theoretically, you could just regenerate it and see that there's no diff with what you had before. You're supposed to check this one in.
Maven version that the wrapper downloads.
Yes. Well, your best bet would probably be to just regenerate the wrapper and say -d Maven is 3.8.7. Imagine it would have existed, or 3.9.0, which is probably going to exist in a few weeks. Any other questions? Yes, please.
I can maybe respond to
Also for the and also for the wrapper.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
Like
Yeah.
there's a new version of Maven now, so I want to upgrade.
That's very interesting. For those of you who weren't able to hear, the Renovate bot will probably in the future also be able to say, hey, you're using the Maven Wrapper, but it is targeted at 3.8.6 and Maven 3.9.0 came out, so time to update your wrapper there. Interesting, I didn't know about that, but that sounds very cool. All right, oh, well, we already got cooking. It's time for our main course, which is decoupling the build and the consumer POM. And this may sound like a very technical thing, but it has some interesting consequences for us as Maven end users as well. So, in a sense, what this does, this decoupling, is making sure that the POM.xml that you have in your Git or Subversion or Mercurial or whatever source control you may have is not necessarily the same POM.xml as that you may have in your company or Maven Central repository. That's what is currently the case. So if I look at what is getting deployed to my company repository or Maven Central, it is essentially the same XML file that lives in my source control. There are a few exceptions to the rule if you use the Maven Flatten plugin, but let's forget about these for a minute. So theoretically, it's the same file, and in practice, it almost ever is the same file. And this gives us a few interesting problems. And that's why we decided to work on a possibility to not have these two files necessarily be the same. So now they can be different. So you're probably wondering, what is that technical problem that you have with this setup? Well, the thing is, there have been many people saying the POM.xml is too verbose. Raise your hand if you ever thought it is a bit, yeah, it is XML. Let's be honest about that. It tends to be a bit verbose, but for some stuff, well, it really feels to people like, hey, this is complex. This is a lot of typing. But if we were to say, okay, we're going to change the POM.xml structure, and you can omit this field or you can leave away that tag, then, well, in the previous situation, your new POM with support for less elements or more elements gets uploaded to Maven Central. And then somebody else who uses a different IDE than you do, or uses another version of Maven than you do, or uses another build tool than you do, but that still relies on the POM XML. I'm looking at Gradle, for instance, or Ivy. They still inspect the POM.xml that lives on Maven Central. And they will look at the XML file and they say, that doesn't make sense. I didn't expect that to be there, or I expected that to be there, but it wasn't there. So, in fact, even though you could, of course, evolve an XML schema in a backward compatible way, it's pretty hard because there's such a plethora of tools that all rely on this structure of the POM and expect it to look in a particular way. So if we could decouple that, we could say, okay, the POM XML that you have in source control can slightly differ from what we have in Maven Central, and that's going to be great. So this actually is the first step that we need to take from an Apache Maven perspective to start evolving the POM from we know it today to where we want to take it. And we do that in such a way that the remainder of the Java ecosystem will not suffer from it. Because, like it or not, somehow, sorry, I was a bit distracted. Like it or not, the POM XML as we know it is kind of a has become kind of a standard that many other tools in the ecosystem rely upon. Let's get cooking again. Let's see what that actually looks like. So, I have a different project today, the Build Consumer project, which is a small multi-module project. I guess you're all familiar with what that looks like. I have modules here, And my project has two modules. It has a lib and it has an app. And well, what you typically see, for instance, my app, POM, has a reference to the parent saying, okay, I have a group ID, an artifact ID, and a version, and that uniquely identifies my parent artifact. And I could not leave out any of these fields, because then, by the rules of Maven coordinates, it would not be a unique identifier anymore. So Maven would not be able to identify the parent artifact. And we can see that actually, because when I... Wow. Inspiring, probably. Never mind, I don't mind. I was just surprised. Okay, well, great. I'm going to run Maven free here. That's an important difference, Maven free. If I say Maven free, compile, compilation will fail. And it will say, hey, your app POM has one error, parent version is missing. Exactly as I just predicted, it says, I don't know for sure what the parent of your project is. But now I'm going to run Maven 4. I'm going to say, compile the project for me. And the project builds fine. How is that possible? Because while reading the POM from disk, Maven actually follows the convention that your parent POM lifts up one directory from your current POM. So if it looks at the project object model for your application, it says, well, the default value for the relative path element that we typically leave out because it's always .pom.xml. Well, but it's still there. It's the default value. It points to a valid POM. And that means that we can actually make the coordinates a little bit less precise. During Devox a couple of weeks ago, somebody said, well, but then you could have just gotten rid of everything, right? Because artifact and group ID, well, they are also implied then because they follow from the pom.xml that lifts up one directory. And theoretically, that is true, but it's mainly there for verification purposes, just to make sure that you didn't make a mistake. Is that all that we can do? No, we can do more. But first, let's not only compile, but also install the project. Because if we now look at the installed project in our Maven repository, .pom, we will see that the version actually got back. So it's there again. This is a decoupling in practice, because this is the installed artifact. This is the artifact that would have been deployed to Maven Central or to your company internal repository, if I would have run Maven deploy rather than Maven install. And we can see that the version has been filled in because it was deduced from what we supplied elsewhere. We can see more examples of that. Rather than looking at the app, we can look at the, let me see, what are the coordinates again? Maybe demos build consumer POM demo. Of course. If we look at the POM of the parent project, we see, for instance, that the modules are stripped out. For the consumer of the POM, so that's probably the Maven installation on your machine or on the build machine or whatever, it doesn't matter that this parent project has a few child modules. It's only relevant during build time. So for deployments, we can leave that information out. But we can do even more, because a typical thing that you do in multi-module projects is that you say, okay, I have a dependency to another module inside my project. In this case, it's the library that my application needs. And it needs to be the same version as the application code base. So I need to say I have a dependency on my group ID, my artifact ID, and version is going to be project version. You almost always say project version here. But you don't need to anymore. You can still compile the project. You can still install the project. And if you look at the installed POM, it will fill in for you, because maybe your consumer expects the fields to be there still, but it doesn't have to be in your Git repository anymore. So decoupling, actually making it possible to fill in parts of the POM based on what we know, based on what we can deduce. We can allow differences between the POM XML on your disk and the POM XML in the central repository. Any questions so far? Yes, please.
Can you also omit the project's version? If you have multi-module, can you remove the version of towards the parent?
Question is, can you remove this version tag as well? No, I don't think you can. It could differ from the parent, theoretically. It doesn't happen often, but yeah, I don't think you can remove this one. One more, please.
Does it always have to be the latest version if you remove it? Or that's the catch, is it?
Does it always have to be the latest? No, but if you do remove, then it will imply project.version. And if you want to differ from that, you can of course say, okay, I'm depending on a different version than project.version, then you will still have to write it out here. So you don't have to omit it, but you can omit it. And you typically, well, as I said, this is the most common scenario. But if you want to stay away from that scenario because, well, whatever reasons you may have, then you can still do so. That's not going to break. All right. So much for decoupling the build and consumer POM. And as I said, even though this may sound like, well, a little bit of minor details, why would we care about this? This is actually a cornerstone for what we expect to happen in Maven, probably version 5, where we can really make significant choices to what the POM looks like. I do see you have a question, but if you don't mind, I'll take it at the end, just for time management purposes. And otherwise, please run into me after the session, right? All right, so after our main course, it's time to move on to the cheeses, or the fromage for those of you who prefer French, which are some nice improvements to the reactor. If I say reactor, who of you knows, without me explaining, what the reactor is, more or less? I see a few people like, I think I know, probably I know, I have a little bit of feeling. In short, the reactor is the part of Maven that actually decides, hey, these are the projects that we're looking at, this is how they relate to each other. And it got introduced with Maven 3. Maven 3 was the version where we first saw multi-module projects. But as any agile project today does, and as many open source projects do, by the way, there were a few rough edges, let's put it that way. Some things that, yeah, sure, they could be better, but at least it works, and we'll see later how we can improve. We all know how that goes, right? It's called minimum viable product or something like that, and then we forget about it, basically. Well, happens in the open source world as well, no problem. And I think the most visible result of that is the fact that many people still feel they must run Maven install when working on a multi-module project. There are even people that create memes around this whole topic on Twitter. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it today due to sickness. Otherwise, they might have been here as well. But the thing is, the fact that many people do Maven install on a multi-module project is actually a workaround for those long-standing issues. The fact is that if you have a project like we just saw with an application that depends on a library, and you would, for instance, run a partial build on that project, so you would say to the reactor, okay, thanks for building up the whole model, but I only want to build the application module, not the lib module, because that one was already built. Then Maven would say, no, I don't know that lib. And that is when we start, that's why many people start with running Maven install, so that the lib gets installed to your local repository, and then they can build the project. But as I said, it's a workaround. And the thing that we basically changed here is that the reactor now is capable of seeing, hey, this is a multi-modular project, and even when I'm running on just a subset of the project, I can detect the fact that the project is a multi-modular project, and I can identify relatively surely what the root module is, and then, and only then, start by building the modules that you requested. Rather than what it used to do before, it would say, okay, you're building this module, and then, okay, so I'm reducing the reactor to this part that you're asking for. Hey, and now I'm missing information. First of all, this is the whole project with everything in it. Aha, you only want to build this part. I'm going to show you in a minute, so don't worry. There is a small caveat there. You need to have a .mvn folder in the root of your project. This is the only way in which Maven can definitely identify this is the root of your project. Maybe you already have this folder because it's also the place where your jvm.config or maven.arg file can go with default JVM options for your build or default arguments for your Maven invocations. And this is really something, as far as I'm concerned, that will improve the daily use of Maven, especially if you invoke it from the command line a lot, like I do, because you can skip this MVN install on every build that you do. And I've seen situations, especially in larger enterprises, with like a 40-module build. And then, of course, I change something in the 38th module. But I also change something in the third module. And then I do, okay, but I just want to run test on this last module. So I do MVN test on that last module, and then it fails because it doesn't see the changes in the third module. Let's see again how that works. Improve reactor. So let's discover the projects. Improve reactor. I have a couple of modules here. I have an API, which is just a public API of my coffee shop project. I have implementations for all the interfaces that I define here. So here I have a bean grinder and beans and ground coffee and whatnot. And the impl module has the actual implementations. And then I have an app that consumes implementations of the API. But the app only compiles against the API, and the implementation is provided at runtime. So let's see what are we going to look at. Well, let's just run the tests and see if it all works. Maven test, and I'm going to do it with Maven free for a minute. Oh, too bad. We have failing tests here. Apparently, we're doing test-driven development, but just not all the way because you're not supposed to check in a failed test, right? Anyway, if that's the case, then we should just look at the implementation. Well, of course, I prepared it a bit, so I know exactly where the problem is. And the problem is that we should just provide a more or less sensible implementation here. Rather than returning null, we would like to have some ground coffee when we grind our beans. Let's see, Maven says, hey, look at that, I'm going to be helpful with you. You can just run Maven again, and you can pass the -rf, coffee shop import. -rf is for resume from. So it lets you resume the build from a module where you earlier had a build failure, in this case, a test failure. Looks great, let's do that. -rf, coffee shop import. I mean, Maven suggests it itself, so it sure has to be good, right? Still a build failure, but it's a different one. Take care. This case, the build actually fails because it can't resolve a dependency. As I said, we're having a multi-module project, but the first thing that Maven does, Maven 3 does, when I say -rf, is it reduces this whole multi-module project to only the, what did I say? The implementation module. And then it says, okay, great, I'm going to compile and test it. But the implementation depends on the API, and the API is no longer available in the reactor. And since I did not run Maven install up front, it can't resolve the dependency. That's a bit of a disappointment as far as I'm concerned. Let's see how that works if we would have been using Maven 4. Well, of course the test still fails. And of course we can make the test succeed. That's the easy part. Now it says Maven -r. That's the first improvement. It does no longer ask you to type which module was the last one that failed, the implementation module. It just remembers that that was the last one that failed. And it is like, well, you probably want to resume there, right? That's the most common thing you could guess. So let's do that, and let's say Maven 4, resume from the test. Resume and run the test goal. And now it works. So what it does, it first creates the big picture of the whole project, knowing that we have an implementation and an app and a library, an API, an implementation and an application, and then saying, okay, but you want to resume from where you previously had a build failure, which was the implementation module. And then you just want to continue the original thing that you wanted to do, which was test the whole project. If I just let it fill one more time, because a question I often get here is, but how does Maven know that? And I'm going to answer that question up front. There's a new file for that, which is target resume.properties. And if you inspect that file, it says, okay, this is when it was generated, not interesting. Remaining projects. These are the modules that I still need to build when I'm going to resume the build. So originally it had like a plan in mind. Okay, so this is the reactor, and I'm going to first build that one, and then build that one, and then finally I can do that. Here it just says, okay, I had a plan, I couldn't finish the plan, but this is what I still have got to do in order to execute my original plan. And then when you run test-r, it says, okay, let me look at what I still had to do to finish my original plan, and then I'm only going to build these modules. I broke the test again, so the build fails again. That's the obvious part. Now, let me just do it like that again. I can still run the test. This works for resume from and the new flag resume, which is going to be a little bit easier because I don't have to do -rf :coffee shop -impl. It also works for the project list, for the also make flag, for the, what else have we got? Oh yeah, and what's interesting to mention, we used to have the project list flag, which is -pl, but we also have the profiles flag, -P, and they had roughly the same syntax for including or excluding modules, /profiles, but not exactly the same syntax, which was very confusing. So we also fixed that. This is definitely going to be a backward compatibility breaking thing, so this is only going to land in a new major version of Maven for that reason. But now the two flags accept the exact same syntax for including and excluding modules or profiles from your reactor. And it also supports the same syntax for, hey, if this project has a profile with this name, included or excluded, where previously it would say, you asked for a profile, but the profile doesn't exist, so I can't exclude it either. That's a bit of a weird situation, right? Some companies have this policy where they say, but if you have integration tests, they must live in a profile with that name, but it's not required. And then they have a default build, and that is going to run with the integration test profile active, and then your project has to define a profile with nothing in it, just to satisfy the build. And now we can actually say activate the profile if it is there. And if it's not there, don't mind. The whole list of flags and everything that you would probably like to know, excuse me for the switch in brightness, but we have no dark mode for the Maven project website. The whole list and all the nitty-gritty details are here in the guide to working with multiple modules in Maven 4. Mind you, there's also a Maven 3 edition of the guide, which is a lot shorter because there are simply less options. This is the extended version, which is for Maven 4, and it describes all the options that you have, including some examples of what it can do, a scenario like, hey, if this is what your project looks like, and differences between Maven 3 and 4. This is what you would do in Maven 3. This is what you would do in Maven 4. Oh, and by the way, some scenarios aren't even possible with Maven 3, but they are possible with Maven 4. Anyway, any questions on this part? One or two, please. Yes, please. Say again, please.
What's required in the top levels of Maven folder to make it work?
What is required in this folder? Nothing. It can be an empty folder. There doesn't have to be a file, but the folder has to be there. To keep it there, for instance, Git would typically not allow an empty folder to be checked in. So what you can do is create a .git keep file inside the folder, just to make sure that everybody on the project has the same folder. But the folder doesn't have to have any contents as long as it's there. That's the only thing. Another question, please? Yes, please. That's right.
Does it work with BOM file as well?
Question, no need for Maven install anymore. Would this also work with a bill of materials, basically? I haven't checked, to be honest. I expect it to work as it is simply as it is just another Maven module. It just doesn't have any source code in it, only a pom.xml. But I expect the reactor to just pick that one up like it would pick up any other module in your project. That's my expectation. Disclaimer, I didn't check. But that's an interesting one. I'm going to take 2 questions for each module. So for you, please, the same question as for the previous gentleman. If you have any question, could we move that one to the end? All right, thank you. Because we have one more thing to discuss, which is the Maven Daemon. And that's going to be our final course for today, don't worry. So what is the goal of the Maven Daemon project? The Maven Daemon is there, simply put, to speed up your builds. Well, I have yet to find the first person that says, I don't want this. See, no one. Everybody wants that. The only disadvantage for those of you who like XKCD is that there's less time for slacking off. Anyway, how does that work? How can we actually make a Maven build faster, like magically? And there's 2 things that the Maven Daemon does, and the first and most impressive one, I think, is it keeps the JVM and the plugins warm. Right now, if you run MVN, it's a shell script, or if you run Maven Wrapper, also a shell script, it boots up a Java virtual machine, and as we all know, that still takes a second or 2. Then the Java virtual machine is going to load the jars that form Maven itself. It's going to read your pom.xml, see that there's a bunch of plugins. It's going to resolve the plugins, load the jar files for that plugins. It's going to keep that all in memory. It runs your build, and then the JVM stops, which is a bit of a waste of time, because it means that all the stuff that we just did is thrown away. And what the Maven Daemon does is it says, okay, I'm going to keep the JVM running. I will keep the whole mental model that I have around your project, its plugins, its dependencies. I'll keep that in mind. And the next time that you run a Maven build, I'm going to run it on that JVM that I still have running over there, which can instantly react to your question of, please run Maven test for me, because it doesn't have to do all the things that I mentioned up front. The second thing that the Maven Daemon does is it runs your build in parallel mode by default. Who of you know the -T switch for Maven for multi-threaded build? Yeah, quite a few people. There is a caveat there, because not all Maven plugins are thread safe, especially the older ones and the non-official ones. They sometimes didn't prepare well for running in a multi-threaded build, a parallel build if you wish. So there's the caveat. If you use any of these plugins, upgrade them, hoping that they are thread safe by then, or replace them or fix them. And the thing is that if a non-thread safe plugin is run inside a parallel build, then essentially you have two builds that well, somehow essentially a Maven plugin is a Java class as well, and there's one instance of that class, and well, that clashes. But the nice improvement there is, if you do use -T, you will often see that, for instance, all those 8 threads are going to jam on your standard out, and if you look at the output of your build, you're like, I can't make any sense out of this. This is just nonsense, because all those threads are just throwing logs at you, and it's like a class full of little children all yelling at you. Well, good luck figuring out what they're all trying to say to you. So the Maven Daemon actually collects the output from each thread, and then by the end of the build, it will give it in a structured way to you. Let's look at what that means in practice. I have a demo project for that. Which is it? Oh, Maven Daemon. But it might be actually more fun to run it on a real-world project, right? Who's up for a little adventure here? Okay, fingers crossed with me, please. I'm going to run it on the actual code base of Maven itself, rather than on my demo project with just 3 modules, which is a bit boring because it's quick anyway. This is the actual Maven code base. Let me see, Maven clean package. And now, first of all, fingers crossed that it actually builds, but usually our build is green, so that should work. And this is going to take a little while because it builds all 30 modules one by one by one. And I'm not even sure if we should wait for this to finish, because it can take a minute or two. How far are we? 9 out of 30. 10 out of 30. Life's too short for this, people. Come on. Let's first start with Maven D status. Maven D, as opposed to Maven W or Maven, is the Maven Daemon, obviously. And --status gives us an overview of actual processes that are still running. None. Well, great. Now we can do Maven D compile. And we see that a daemon got started, and it's running pretty fast already. We're at 10 seconds, and we are at 26 out of 30 modules. That's already a lot quicker than we saw, and this is just because we're doing the multi-threaded build by default. Bam, 22 seconds. I think in 22 seconds, we were only at module number 9. 22 seconds, I'm going to run it again. Now wait, let's look at the status. You see we have 1 daemon running. I'm going to run compile again. This one should be even quicker. At least that's what theory tells us. 6 seconds. Is that quicker or is that quicker? Sorry, no time for slacking off anymore. Speaking of slacking off, I saw that we have only 5 minutes. So this is just in a nutshell what the Maven Daemon does. I want to quickly discuss the timelines and then we're wrapping up. So the Maven Wrapper is already available today. You can run it in the way that I showed you with wrapper column wrapper. Nothing to add there. You can just start using it. Build consumer POM, or actually the decoupling of the build and consumer POM, is going to make it into Maven 4. We have some really complex stuff there that we just don't want to and probably can't even backport to Maven 3.9. So although the feature is finished, you can't use it today. And please mind that some plugins, especially the Maven GPG plugin, will no longer work. They simply don't understand the fact that the POM that lives here is different from the POM that lives there. So you need to update or replace them with different plugins that do understand. The improvements in the reactor will make it into Maven 4 as well. As I said, they're breaking backward compatibility, so we're not even considering to backport them. And then we have the Maven Daemon, which is already available today. I used to tell people, the only disadvantage is that the CLI for it, so the mvnd command, doesn't run on Apple Silicon, but it does. Last month, version 0.8.2 was released with also a native executable for Apple Silicon processors, but this may break if your build uses any non-thread safe plugins. Summarizing, Maven Wrapper and Maven Daemon, good to go. Build consumer decoupling and improve reactor, have a little bit of patience. Speaking of which, a little bit of patience, the Maven project could definitely use your help here. Please try to test these features on your project. The bigger, the more complex your project is, the better it is to us, because that gives us the most valuable information. We have a few friendly folks from the Apache Camel community that also run our snapshots, and they gave us very valuable feedback in terms of, hey, with our 900 module project, some things broke. Great. If you're able to spot a bug, could you please help us by creating a reproducer as small as possible and consider submitting that to the issue tracker for the Apache Maven project so that we can actually investigate and fix your bug. That's a lot easier if there's a reproducer project than if you just say, hey, I've got my internal project in my company, 900 modules, and it fails. I'm sorry, we really can't help you out there. And finally, of course, report what you found. So with that, I would like to thank you for joining me today. All the demo projects are on my GitHub page, and you can inspect it through the QR code or just link. I will upload slides, and they will have a link as well. And I've got one question left for you, which is, if you leave the room, please rate the session using the app. I don't think there's a panel here at the door, but please use the app so that I can further improve the session and make it even more interesting. Thanks again, and enjoy the remainder of today.